Welcome back, everybody. Today we're deep diving into Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. You guys sent in a ton of notes and excerpts on this one, so let's get into it. What are some of the biggest takeaways about these two systems running the show up in our brains?
Well, it's so fascinating how Kahneman breaks down human thinking into these two systems, right? System one, that quick, intuitive part of us, and then system two, the slower, more deliberate one.
It's almost like there's two pilots in our minds, but one's way more likely to, doze off.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. System one is that skilled, instinctual pilot. It's great at handling the routine stuff, like, recognizing a friend's face in a crowd or just knowing instantly that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But system one can be prone to jumping to conclusions, relying on those mental shortcuts, the heuristics.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Heuristics can be really helpful, but they can also lead to some, crazy biases. What's an example we might run into every day?
Oh, well, think about the availability heuristic. We tend to judge the likelihood of something happening based on, how easily we can recall examples. It's like if you see a dramatic news story about a shark attack last week, you're certainly assuming shark attacks are super common.
So our minds glom onto those vivid examples, and that can totally warp how we see risk.
Exactly. And it can affect us in ways we don't even realize. If you're reading all these articles about data breaches all the time, you might start thinking it's way more likely to happen to you than it actually is statistically.
It's like our brains are playing what's most memorable instead of what's most likely.
Yeah, precisely. And this ties into how emotions get all mixed up in our decisions, especially when we're thinking about potential losses. We really feel the sting of a loss way more strongly than we feel the joy of, an equal gain.
Which, makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Avoiding danger was probably super important for our ancestors to, not die.
Oh, absolutely. That instinct is still with us big time. It explains why people do things like hold on to losing investments for way longer than they should. They're just trying to avoid that feeling of loss. Fear is a powerful motivator.
So even when we know logically that cutting our losses is the best move, our emotions can, hijack the whole thing.
Totally. And that brings us to another really interesting area.
Yeah.
How the way choices are presented or framed can totally change how we make decisions.
Oh, okay. Tell me more about framing.
Okay, so think about this. Imagine there's a medical treatment with a 90% survival rate. Sounds pretty good, right? But what if someone told you it has a 10% mortality rate?
Technically, it's the same information. It's just, coming at it from a different angle.
You got it. But studies show that people are way more likely to choose the treatment when it's framed with that 90% survival rate, even though logically the outcome is the same. It's because the way it's presented taps into our emotions, especially that aversion to loss we were just talking about.
So even when we're trying to be totally rational, our emotions are still in the driver's seat.
It's true. There's this experiment, the coffee mug experiment, that shows this really well. Researchers randomly gave people either a coffee mug or a chocolate bar, both of equal value. Then they offered everyone the chance to trade.
I feel like you'd expect a 50-50 split, right? If they're both equally good, why not trade?
But that's not what happened. Almost no one wanted to trade. They had this, instant attachment to the thing they already had, even if they'd only had it for a few minutes.
That's wild. So just a tiny taste of ownership can set off this whole loss aversion thing if we think about giving it up.
Totally. And this all goes back to framing, right? Because how we see a choice as either a potential gain or a potential loss can be influenced by, the tiniest things in how it's presented.
So knowing that, how do we, get better at spotting these framing effects and not fall for them? Should we all try to be emotionless robots when we make decisions?
Well, turning off our emotions entirely is probably not going to happen. But the key is just being aware of them. When you're facing a decision, try to reframe it in your mind. Look at it from a bunch of different angles. Ask yourself, is this just sounding good because of how they're saying it? What are the potential losses and gains if I flip it around and look at it differently?
So it's about taking a beat and letting our more deliberate System 2 pilot, look over the situation before our quick thinking emotional System 1 takes the controls and maybe crashes the plane.
Yes. And, that actually leads to a really interesting point. The invisible gorilla experiment shows how easily we can get so focused that we miss really important information.
Oh, yeah, the one where people are so busy counting basketball passes that they completely miss a person in a gorilla suit walking right through. It sounds unbelievable, but it makes a good point.
Exactly. The experiment shows that even when we think we're paying attention, our system 1 can just filter out stuff that's unexpected, especially if our system 2 is already working on something hard.
So it's almost like our brains are choosing what to see based on what we're already focused on.
Precisely. And that has huge implications for how we process information and make choices. We might be missing out on key details or different perspectives just because our attention is so narrow.
It's a good reminder to, zoom out every once in a while and be open to things that might challenge what we think we know.
I agree. And speaking of things we think we know, Kahneman really dives into how we tend to overestimate how accurate our own judgments are, especially in areas where we think we're experts. He calls it the illusion of validity.
And this is where his own background as a military psychologist comes in, right?
Yeah. He and his team, they developed all these tests to try to predict how soldiers would perform. But even when the data showed that their predictions were basically random, they still felt really confident in their individual assessments.
So it's like our brains are wired to feel certain, even when statistically we probably shouldn't be.
Exactly. And this illusion of validity, it can be especially tricky in areas where we have a lot of experience because it can lead to being way overconfident in making bad decisions.
So how do we, combat that? Should we just constantly be second-guessing everything we think?
Not necessarily. It's about finding that balance between trusting our intuition and, admitting that it's not perfect. Kahneman talks about using something called reference class forecasting, where we basically look at historical data or base rates for similar situations to make better predictions.
So instead of just going with my gut on how long a project will take, I should look at how long other similar projects have taken in the past, get some real-world data to balance out my natural optimism.
Yeah, exactly. It's about using data to ground our predictions,
Yeah.
To admit that our intuition isn't always right. We shouldn't throw our intuition out entirely, but we should, be aware of its limitations.
That's a really helpful insight. And it reminds us that our brains are super complex and incredible, but they definitely aren't perfect.
Totally. And as we dig deeper into Kahneman's work, we'll keep uncovering all these fascinating quirks of how humans think and, how they affect our decisions, our judgments, even our happiness.
It's so weird how we, crave certainty. We're always trying to find patterns, even when they might not actually be there. Kahneman talks about that a lot with, statistics and probability.
Oh,
right?
yeah, for sure. A big chunk of the book is about how our intuition just clashes with statistical thinking sometimes. We're great at coming up with explanations for things, even if it's just random chance.
And, we want to believe everything happens for a reason, even when it's just totally random. Is there, an example from the book that shows that?
Yeah, he talks about these flight instructors who noticed that whenever they praised a cadet for doing really well, the next time they, wouldn't do as well. And when they yelled at cadets for messing up, they often saw improvement. So they thought, oh, praise makes them lazy and criticism makes them try harder.
Which, makes sense. Isn't that how positive reinforcement works?
It does seem like that, right? But it's actually a misinterpretation of something Kahneman calls regression to the mean. Basically, when someone has a really good or bad performance, it's statistically likely that the next time they'll be closer to average, just because of natural variation.
So it's like if you flip a coin and get 10 heads in a row, it doesn't mean the coin is rigged. It's just way more likely the next flips will have some tails in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those flight instructors, they were taking credit for these changes in performance when it was probably just random. And, this happens everywhere. Think about a company that has a crazy good year. Statistically, they're probably going to have a more normal year after that, even if they keep doing all the same things.
Right, right. So we shouldn't always assume our actions have this huge impact. Sometimes things just ebb and flow naturally. We have to be aware of that, the regression to the mean thing to make good judgments.
Absolutely. It all comes back to the illusion of validity, too. It's easy to be super confident in what we think, even when the data is telling us maybe we shouldn't be.
Like Kahneman with those soldier predictions. Even with proof that they were basically guessing, he and his team still felt sure of themselves.
It's true. And it's not just that one field, right? Finance, medicine, anything where people see themselves as experts, they can fall into that overconfidence trap, especially with tons of experience.
Okay, so how do we avoid doing that? If even experts can get tricked by their own confidence, what can the rest of us do?
Well, Kahneman suggests this thing called reference class forecasting. Basically, stepping back from our own experience
Hmm.
and looking at like historical data for similar situations, those base rates.
So, like, instead of just guessing how long a project will take, I should look up how long similar projects usually take, get some actual numbers to balance out my overly optimistic brain.
Exactly. It's all about using data to like ground our predictions,
Hmm.
to admit that our intuition isn't always 100% right. We shouldn't ignore intuition completely, but we should know when to be skeptical.
It makes you think about all that stuff about how algorithms are actually better at some things than humans are.
Oh, definitely. He has some really interesting examples in the book, like the APGAR score. It's this super simple test to check on newborn babies, and it's amazingly accurate for figuring out which ones need help right away.
It's kind of counterintuitive, right? You think the more complex something is, the better it works. But sometimes a simple system is way more accurate.
I know. And it's not about like getting rid of human judgment altogether. It's about realizing that we all have biases. Our thinking isn't always consistent. And a good algorithm can help us overcome that, help us be more objective.
So it's not a competition, humans versus machines. It's about using both the right way.
That's a great way to put it. And this is really important in areas with loads of data, like, finance or healthcare. An algorithm can sift through all that information and see patterns we might miss.
It's a cool idea. It's like we can use data to boost our own abilities and make smarter choices.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that algorithms aren't like magic. They're only as good as the data they use. And they can't always handle those super complex situations.
So, when should we go with our gut instead of an algorithm?
Kahneman says that real experts are good at knowing what they don't know. They can feel when to trust their gut and when they need more information, or when to use a more structured approach.
It's all about self-awareness, right? Knowing what our brains are good at and where they tend to mess up.
Yes, and having some humility, too. We have to admit that our minds aren't perfect prediction machines. We all make mistakes, even the experts.
Pam, this whole conversation has been so interesting. It's crazy to see all these little quirks and how we think and how they can help us or totally screw us over. Makes me want to learn more about how to actually use this stuff in everyday life.
It is fascinating, isn't it? That's what makes Kahneman's work so awesome. It's not just about understanding our minds, but about actually using that knowledge to think better and make better decisions. To maybe even live a better life.
It's kind of funny. We've been talking about all these like mental quirks and biases, but it makes me wonder about the bigger picture. How does this stuff actually affect how happy we are? Does understanding our own thinking really help us live a better life?
That's a great point. And it's something Kahneman gets into, too. He talks about these two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. Like the experiencing self is all about what's happening right now, the actual feelings and sensations. But the remembering self is the one that makes sense of it all, the one that tells the story of our lives.
It's like we all have an inner biographer who's like constantly shaping our life story based on our memories.
That's it. And the funny thing is, those two selves don't always agree. Like Kahneman talks about how our memories get distorted by what he calls the peak end rule. We tend to remember things based on the most intense part and how it ends, not the whole experience.
So it's like a vacation with one amazing moment, like an epic sunset or something, might stick with us more than a trip that was good the whole time, but didn't have any huge highs, even if that chill trip was technically longer and more relaxing.
Exactly. How long something lasts doesn't always matter as much as we think it does. It's those big moments and how it wraps up that really color how we remember it.
That's so interesting. It makes me think we should, like, try to create more of those peak moments and end things on a good note. Maybe that's the secret to being happier. Give our remembering self a good story.
It's a good strategy. And it shows how understanding our memory can help us make better choices. Like if we know those peak and end moments are so important, we can try to make them happen more.
But then it makes you wonder, which self should we actually listen to? Should we always try to make the right now self as happy as possible, even if it means our remembering self won't be as happy later?
That's a tough one. And Kahneman doesn't really give a simple answer. He says both selves matter. Sometimes it's good to focus on the long-term satisfaction, even if it means, putting up with some unpleasantness in the short term.
Like sticking with a project that's hard right now but will feel really good to finish. Or, going on a challenging hike that might suck while you're doing it, but you'll have an awesome memory of it.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
It makes me think about how we always want more stuff. Like, we think buying things will make us happy, but maybe those things don't actually make our day-to-day lives that much better. Maybe it's more about our remembering self, being able to say, I got that cool thing.
That's a really interesting thought. And, Kahneman's research does show that while money can make us happier up to a point, after that, it doesn't really matter as much. Like, how much we enjoy each day depends on a lot more than just how much stuff we have.
It's like real wealth is about having cool experiences and good memories, not just a bunch of possessions.
I think so. And it's about, recognizing how powerful our minds are. Kahneman talks about this thing called the focusing illusion. It's basically how we tend to think whatever we're focused on is way more important than it actually is.
So, like, if we're always thinking about what we don't have a bigger house or whatever, it's going to make us unhappy, even if our lives are actually pretty good.
Right. But if we focus on the good stuff, our friends, our health, the things we love to do, we'll feel a lot happier overall. Where we put our attention makes a huge difference.
It's almost like choosing to see the good stuff instead of focusing on the bad. We actually have more control over how we experience things than we realize.
I love that. It's about being mindful,
Mhm.
Pay attention to the good things, appreciate the stuff that matters.
Well, this has been a mind-blowing deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We covered so much: how our thinking works, the biases that mess with our judgments, how things are presented, statistics, happiness, like a whole new way of understanding ourselves.
Totally. And I think the most important thing is realizing that our minds are both incredible and kind of flawed. By understanding how we think, we can make better choices, think more clearly, and, yeah, live better lives.
So, as we go out there and deal with the world, let's remember to engage that system too. Watch out for those sneaky biases and enjoy the moments that make us happy. And maybe, most importantly, let's keep learning and exploring and questioning how our minds work because, like Kahneman shows us, it's a really fascinating journey.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
And to you, our listener, we leave you with this. How are you going to use what we talked about today? What biases are you going to watch out for? What choices are you going to make differently? Because ultimately, understanding and shaping your mind is up to you.